My mother-in-law did not wait for me to heal. 1 week after my miscarriage, she put my suitcase on the porch and told me I had nothing left to stay for, as if grief had erased my place in that home. By sunset, I had lost the nursery, my savings, and my father's rocking chair because she changed the alarm code before I could come back for it. I spent 3 years rebuilding from that sidewalk up, one quiet decision at a time. That kind of timing is why people never forget best revenge stories. The sharpest best revenge stories turn eviction into ownership. The coldest best revenge stories arrive with paperwork, not shouting. The cleanest best revenge stories make the same front door mean something new. And the strongest best revenge stories begin when the woman you threw out returns holding the auction receipt. Stay with me until the keys change hands, because buying that house was not the whole story. The cruelest thing she did was not putting my suitcase on the porch. It was deciding that the weakest week of my life was the right time to teach me I was replaceable. And the part that still keeps people talking is what she asked me after the sale, when she realized I was the reason she no longer had a home. When I married Mark, I did not think I was marrying a cruel family. I thought I was marrying into one of those tidy, sturdy American households that always looked more solid from the outside than they were on the inside. The house sat on a quiet street with old sycamores and cracked sidewalks and neighbors who had known each other long enough to recognize one another's grocery bags. It was a 2-story place with pale siding, a deep front porch, and a half-finished lower level that Mark's father had once turned into a den. After his father died, Diane moved back in under the language families use when they want something to sound temporary. Just until she got her footing. Just until she figured out next steps. Just until it made sense. Nothing about Diane was temporary. She had a suite on the first floor. Mark and I had the upstairs bedroom, the back room we planned to turn into a nursery, and the kind of marriage that still looked hopeful if you didn't stare at it too long. I was 32 then. Mark was 35. We had been married a little over 2 years. Long enough to know each other's habits. Not long enough for me to understand that his worst habit was calling passivity peace. He was not a man who yelled. A lot of women would hear that and think it meant safety. I used to think that too. But some men don't yell, because they don't stand anywhere long enough to need a raised voice. They step aside. They soften their tone. They say, let's not make this worse, while something important is being taken from you in the room right in front of them. Diane knew exactly how to use that. She never came at me with cartoon villain lines. It was smaller than that. More believable. She would correct me in front of people over things that didn't matter. She would tell Mark I seemed tired or emotional in the careful voice people use when they want to sound concerned and superior at the same time. She would move things in the kitchen, and then smile when I couldn't find them. She would say things like, "This house has its own rhythm," which really meant, "You are still an addition here." The strange part is that I still tried. I cooked on Sundays. I scrubbed grout in a bathroom I didn't even use much. I helped pick paint colors for the downstairs hall when Diane decided the old beige was depressing. I paid for half a new washer and dryer after the old set gave up. I covered groceries more often than Mark noticed. I bought curtains for the room we said would become the nursery, and I measured for shelves and folded tiny clothes, with the kind of careful hope that makes people gentler if they love you right. When I got pregnant, the whole house changed for about 3 weeks. Even Diane softened then. Or maybe she knew how to imitate softness when the audience was good. She called the baby our little miracle in front of church friends. She told the neighbor across the street that the family had been blessed. She brought up old baby things she had saved in boxes, some of them too yellowed to use, but I thanked her anyway. Mark started standing differently in rooms. More square somehow. Like fatherhood had already given him a shape he'd wanted for years. For a little while I thought maybe this was the thing that would fix the strange balance in that house. Maybe a child would force all of us into something more honest. Maybe Diane would finally see me as permanent. Maybe Mark would stop trying to keep everyone comfortable and start choosing what mattered. I should have known better than to build hope in a house where ownership and affection were always tangled together. The one thing I insisted on for the nursery was my father's rocking chair. My father died 3 years before I got married. He wasn't a rich man. He didn't leave behind land or investments, or a clean, organized legacy. He left tools with worn handles, a watch that no longer kept perfect time, a few flannel shirts that still smelled like cedar if you opened the storage bin in winter, and that rocking chair. It had sat in my childhood home near the front window. He used to read in it after dinner. Later, when he got sick, he sat in it more than anywhere else. After he died, my mother asked if there was anything I wanted before she downsized. I took the chair. I had imagined rocking my baby in it before I even said that out loud to anyone. Diane saw me carry it upstairs one Saturday and stopped at the doorway with that little pause she used when she thought something sentimental was inconvenient. "That old thing," she said. "You're putting that in the baby's room. It was my dad's." She gave me a smile so thin it barely counted. Well, I guess every room needs a story. At the time, I let it go. That is one of the hardest parts of looking back at a betrayal. You remember all the moments your body noticed before your mind was ready to. The miscarriage happened quietly. That's the only word I know for it now. Quietly, and then not quietly at all. I won't turn it into something dramatic for the sake of the story. It was awful, in the plain way real loss is awful. The kind that empties a room without moving the furniture. The kind that makes people use the gentlest voice they have and still fail you. For a week afterward, I moved through the house like someone who had been pushed out of time. My body felt foreign. My thoughts felt slow. The nursery door stayed half open because I couldn't make myself close it and couldn't stand looking at it for long. The little folded clothes sat in a basket on the dresser. The rocking chair waited in the corner beside a lamp I had picked out on clearance, still proud that I had found something beautiful for cheap. Mark cried once. Then he switched into management mode. Calls to return. Insurance forms. A quiet conversation with his boss in the driveway. He kissed my forehead a lot. He kept saying, "We'll get through this." But he said it the way people say traffic will clear, when what they mean is they hope someone else solves it. Diane changed faster. Not outwardly. Not in ways anyone could quote back to her and prove. She just became practical. Too practical. Grim in a way that sounded efficient instead of cruel. She started saying I needed rest. She started saying stress was bad for recovery. She started talking about how the upstairs felt heavy. She told Mark maybe I should stay with my sister for a little while. I told her no the first time, kindly the second time directly, and the third time by walking past her. What I remember now is that she began saying Mark's house again. She had stopped for a while when I was pregnant. It had become the house then. Or home. Or the baby's room. But after the loss, the old vocabulary came back like she had been storing it behind her teeth. "You should let my son sleep tonight. My son has work in the morning. My son is worried about you. My son. My son. My son. Not your husband. Not the two of you. Not your home." I didn't know then that language is sometimes the first lock people turn before they touch the door. One afternoon, maybe 5 days after we came home from the doctor, I was in the nursery doorway with a trash bag in my hand, trying to decide whether I could pack anything away without falling apart when Diane appeared at the bottom of the doctor stairs. Her voice floated up like we were discussing weather. "I had the alarm company out this morning," she said. "The system was glitching." I looked down at her. "Okay." She nodded like that settled something between us. "Just so you know, the code's been updated." I should have understood that line the way I understand it now. At the time, I barely heard it. I just said fine and went back to staring at a room that no longer knew what it was for. That was the shape of those days. You miss the warning because your whole body is already trying to survive something else. Mark and I stopped talking like a married couple and started talking like coworkers assigned to a quiet emergency. He brought me tea. I thanked him. He asked if I'd eaten. I said I wasn't hungry. At night he lay beside me without touching me, much as if grief had made us both fragile in different ways, and he wasn't sure which version of me he'd break. One evening I told him, "Your mother wants me out of here." He looked up from his phone. "She thinks space might help." Space for who? He rubbed his forehead. "Can we not do this tonight?" That was his real religion. Not family, not loyalty, not even love. Relief. Can we not do this tonight? Can we not do this right now? Can we not make this bigger? The problem with men like that is, they think refusing to choose is a way to stay clean. It isn't. It just means the dirtiest person in the room chooses for them. A few days later, I tried to carry a box of nursery things down to the hall closet because I couldn't stand seeing it every time I passed the room. Diane was in the kitchen, drying a mug, when I set the box on the counter, for a second to fix my grip. She looked at the tiny folded blankets on top and said, "You know, sometimes holding on too hard keeps you stuck." I stared at her. There are sentences you can only say to a woman in pain. if you believe her pain has lowered her rank. I took the box back upstairs without answering. That night I sat in my father's rocking chair in the dark nursery and realized something I should have understood much sooner. Diane did not think of my loss as sacred. She thought of it as useful. That was the moment the fear changed shape. Not because I suddenly became strong. I wasn't strong yet. I was tired and raw and halfway broken. But for the first time, I stopped wondering whether I was imagining her, and started wondering what she would do next if no one stopped her. And the truth is, no one was going to stop her. Not Mark, not the house, not grief. If someone used your weakest week to start pushing you out of your own life, would you ever call that family again? The answer came faster than I wanted it to. A week after the miscarriage, I came downstairs and found my suitcase on the porch. Not by the door. Not packed in the bedroom. Not waiting in the hall for a conversation. On the porch. One upright suitcase. One duffel bag. My winter coat folded over the handle. A grocery bag with toiletries shoved inside. Like I was a college kid being sent home between semesters. Like I had overstayed somewhere informal. For one full second I thought there had to be some explanation so stupid it would embarrass me for assuming the worst. Then Diane stepped into the front doorway behind the screen and said, "This is better." That was the first line. Not hello, not sit down, not I'm sorry. This is better. Mark was behind her in the foyer. Shoes on, tie loosened. Face already wrong in that familiar way, the look he got when he wanted a bad thing to pass quickly and leave him blameless. I stood there in socks on the front walk and said, "What is this?" Diane crossed her arms. "You need to recover somewhere else." I looked at Mark. "Tell me this is not happening." He didn't. That silence still has a texture in my memory. Clean, polished, cowardly. Diane kept going because of course she did. "This house belongs to my son, and right now what he needs is peace. You need your own people around you. This arrangement isn't healthy anymore." I said, "I live here." Her eyes moved over me calm as a knife laid flat on a table. For what I honestly think that was the moment something in me stopped trying to be loved by them. Not because I got brave. Because I finally heard the full sentence inside the partial one. For what? For what now that there was no baby? For what now that the room upstairs was only a room again? For what now that grief had made me inconvenient instead of celebrated? She looked me in the face 1 week after I lost my pregnancy, and asked the ugliest question a woman can be asked in a home she helped build around hope. For what? I felt heat move through my chest, so suddenly I thought I might be sick right there on the porch. "My clothes are upstairs," I said. "My things are upstairs. We packed what you'll need," Diane said. "You'll need. Not what's yours. Not take your time. Not let's do this decently." I stepped toward the door and Diane shifted just enough to block it. Not with drama. Not with force. With the confidence of a woman who already knew the man behind her would not move her. "Move," I said. Mark finally spoke. "Rachel, that's my name. Rachel." The first time he used it in that whole scene it sounded like something administrative. "Move," I said again, this time to both of them. Diane's voice got softer. She always lowered it when she wanted to sound reasonable to herself. "You are not well enough for a fight." I laughed once. "A bad sound. You put my suitcase outside." "And if I hadn't," she said, "you would have dragged this out." Dragged this out. As if my marriage was a dentist appointment I'd failed to cancel. I looked at Mark and said, "Did you know she was doing this?" He swallowed. "Mom thinks I didn't ask what your mother thinks." That was when the neighbor across the street looked up from pruning something near her front steps. Mrs. Alvarez. Mid-60s. Sharp eyes. Kind mouth. The kind of woman who never pretended not to see. Humiliation changes temperature. The second someone else witnesses it. Diane saw her too. I know she did. But she didn't stop. Shame only works on people who think they owe decency to the world looking at them. "This does not need to be public," Diane said. I turned slowly and looked at the suitcase she had placed on the porch for the entire block to read. "No," I said. "It already is." Mark came one step closer, still inside the doorway. "Still under that roof. Maybe you should go to your sister's for a few days. There are sentences that end marriages before the paperwork starts. That was ours." I said. "A few days." He didn't answer. Diane did. "Until you're in a better frame of mind." A better frame of mind. The language of people who want to erase you always sounds cleaner than the act itself. I grabbed the duffel and opened it right there on the porch. Pajamas, underwear, a toothbrush, sweatpants, a charger. No wallet, no folder with my documents, no jewelry box, no nursery receipts, no framed photo of my father I kept on the dresser, no rocking chair. I looked up. Where is everything else? Diane said. You have enough for now. My father's chair is upstairs. She let out the smallest sigh, like sentiment was exhausting. Rachel. I stepped toward the doorway so fast Mark finally moved, not to defend me, but to stop me from crossing in. Don't, he said. I stared at him. That is the face I remember more clearly than the suitcase. Not because it was crueler than Diane's, because it was weaker. Cruelty you can name. Weakness inside betrayal takes longer. It keeps asking if maybe you expected too much from someone who never promised to be brave. Don't, what I said. Just go cool off, he said quietly. Cool off. 1 week after I lost our baby, after your mother put my clothes outside, after she packed a duffel bag for me like I was an unwanted guest. Cool off. I remember Mrs. Alvarez setting down her pruning shears across the street. I remember a dog barking somewhere farther up the block. I remember the screen door closing between me and the foyer with a soft, ordinary sound which somehow made it uglier. This was not a movie scene. No one yelled. No one threw anything. They just closed me out of my own life with household efficiency. I dragged the suitcase off the porch because I suddenly couldn't stand the idea of it sitting there any longer. I drove to my sister Leah's apartment with tears I was too numb to feel properly. When she opened the door and saw the suitcase behind me, she didn't ask questions first. She just pulled me inside and said, "Okay, you're here." Sometimes the first dignity you get back after an humiliation is just being welcomed by someone who doesn't need the details before they open the door. I slept on Leah's couch that night. Or I lay there while the room changed color around me, and my phone lit up with messages from numbers I did and did not want to see. Diane texted once. This separation is best for everyone. Mark texted twice. The first said, please don't make this uglier than it is. The second 40 minutes later said, we all need some time. We all. That collective language cowards use when they want to hide one person's choices inside a fog. At 6 the next morning I texted Mark. I'm coming by for the rocking chair and my documents. He didn't answer for nearly 2 hours. When he finally did, his message was 4 words longer than it needed to be. Mom changed the code. Just give it a few days. I stared at that line until I knew I would never forget it. Not because of the code, because it told me everything. The alarm update Diane had mentioned on the stairs. The suitcase already packed. The certainty in her voice. She hadn't thrown me out in the heat of an argument. She had scheduled it. She had planned the lockout before she placed the suitcase on the porch. I called him immediately. He let it ring out. I called again. Voicemail. I texted, my father's chair is not yours to keep. No response. I texted, my passport and birth certificate are in the file box in the closet. Hours later, Diane replied from Mark's phone. We will arrange pickup when things are calmer. Things are calmer. The woman who weaponized the worst week of my life wanted me to wait for a future version of myself that would be easier for her to manage. Leah wanted to go over there herself. My sister has always been made of sparks, where I'm made of slow-burning coals. She stood in her kitchen in old leggings and fury and said I will stand on that porch and make them hand me every single thing. I almost let her, but something in me had gone very still. I need my documents, I said. Not a scene. That afternoon I called the non-emergency police line and asked what I could do. The answer was what those answers usually are when dignity has been stolen in a domestic setting but not in a way clean enough for anyone else to fix quickly. Civil matter. Ownership unclear. If I feared destruction of personal property, I could speak to an attorney. Civil matter. There is a special kind of loneliness in learning that the law often arrives after the insult, not before. Leah drove me back there the next day anyway, not to fight, to stand with me while I asked for what was mine. No one answered the door. I know Diane was inside because the downstairs curtain shifted. I know Mark was inside because his truck was in the drive. The house looked exactly the same as it always had, which felt obscene somehow. The herb pots near the front steps still sat in their little row. The porch light still leaned slightly crooked because Mark kept saying he'd fix it. My wind chime still hung from the side hook and moved in a breeze I couldn't feel. I knocked again. Nothing. Leah swore under her breath. Then Mrs. Alvarez opened her front door across the street and came down halfway to the sidewalk. I saw you the other day, she said carefully. I'm sorry. That almost broke me more than anything else. I said, did they say anything to you? She hesitated, then came closer. Your mother-in-law told me you needed rest with your family. But that didn't look like rest to me. No, it hadn't. That was the first moment I understood there would be two versions of what happened. The one they would tell, and the one people had actually seen. By the end of that week, an attorney sent a letter. My documents appeared in a taped-up box on Leah's building porch 2 days later, delivered while no one was home. My passport was there. My birth certificate was there. A few pieces of jewelry. Not the nursery receipts. Not the framed photo. Not the rocking chair. The message was clear enough. You can have what proves you exist on paper, not what proves you belonged. I kept every text, every date, every envelope, every screenshot. Not because I thought I was building a case then. Because when people start rewriting you while you're still bleeding, records become a form of self-respect. Mark filed for divorce 6 weeks later. Grounds: irreconcilable differences. I laughed when my attorney read that phrase out loud. Not because it was funny, because after all that ugliness, the official language still wanted to sound civilized. The divorce itself was as thin and bloodless as the marriage had become. No children, separate retirement accounts, some joint household expenses, some arguments over contributions that never felt worth the cost of proving in full. He had the better lawyer, because Diane paid for part of it, though I didn't know that officially until later. By then I had already learned that families like theirs don't spend money to save love. They spend money to preserve the version of events they can live with. He kept the house. A year later he deeded it to Diane. That detail mattered more than I knew at the time. I only learned it because Leah's friend worked in a real estate office, and without giving me anything improper, mentioned one day over coffee that the property records had changed. Mark had transferred his interest out. Diane had taken the house fully into her own hands. Leah looked at me carefully when she said it. I remember stirring bad coffee and thinking, of course she did. Of course the woman who told me I had nothing left to stay for could not bear to hold that power informally. She needed it written down. That should have satisfied her. It didn't, because control has a way of getting expensive. About 6 months after the divorce was final, I ran into an old church acquaintance at the grocery store. She did that awkward thing people do when they know just enough about your pain to be curious but not brave enough to admit it. After a few false starts, she said, I heard Diane is doing one of those mortgage things older people do. I looked at her. What mortgage things? She shrugged. You know, against the house. To make life easier. A reverse mortgage. I didn't say it out loud then. I just let the phrase settle. Later that night I looked it up. I read too much. Terms. Conditions, default triggers, obligations, taxes, insurance, deferred maintenance, occupancy rules. What happens when confidence gets mistaken for cash flow? What happens when a person uses a house like a throne and a lifeboat at the same time? That was the first night I understood. The house might not stay in her hands forever. Not because justice always comes. Because arrogance is bad long-term planning. For the first time since the porch I felt something that was not pure pain. Not hope exactly. Smaller than hope. A crack in certainty. The house was still standing. Diane was still living in it. My father's rocking chair was still inside. But the thing she had used to humiliate me was no longer solid in my mind. It had become vulnerable to math maintenance signatures, timelines, and the kind of neglect pride creates in private. Paperwork not shouting. That line stayed with me. The problem was, paperwork requires a version of your life stable enough to use it. And mine wasn't stable yet. I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment by then, finally off Leah's couch after months of saving and apologizing and pretending I was less embarrassed than I was. The apartment smelled faintly like old paint in summer and radiator heat in winter. The bathroom tile was cracked near the tub. The kitchen window stuck when it rained. It was the first place I had ever paid for completely on my own. That mattered more than I let anyone see. The first night I slept there, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, and realized I had spent months measuring every room by absence. No nursery. No husband. No rocking chair. No second set of keys on the hook. No downstairs footsteps that might turn into commentary. No mother-in-law claiming heir, as if it came with her name on it. Silence is different when it's yours. I got a temp job first. Reception desk work at a small title company downtown. Phones. Copying. File prep. Coffee runs when the closing schedule got ugly. I took it because Leah knew someone who knew someone and because I needed something fast. What I did not expect was how cleanly the work would rearrange my brain. All day I handled documents that decided where people slept, what belonged to whom, what counted, what had to be proven, what was assumed, what was recorded, and what disappeared because someone trusted a promise more than a filing. I learned what liens look like when they start quietly. I learned how county records speak without emotion. I learned that homes do not change hands because someone cries harder. They change hands because someone signs, defaults, dies, transfers, fails, or refuses in the right place at the right time. It was the opposite of the porch. That may be why I stayed. I didn't become some glamorous career woman overnight. My life did not turn into a montage. I learned slowly. I worked carefully. I went home tired. I reheated soup. I paid down debt. I stopped checking Mark's social media. I bought a used car after mine finally gave up. I built an emergency fund with amounts so small at first, they would have embarrassed the version of me that once bought nursery curtains without checking my balance twice. But every step upward was tied to what I had lost. Every time I put money aside, I remembered what it felt like to discover how little of our life had truly been accessible to me once I was no longer wanted inside it. Every time I saw a transfer recorded, I remembered Diane saying the house belonged to her son, as if place itself could be granted or revoked based on usefulness. Every time I printed out tax histories or loan notices for a file, I remembered the screen door closing and Mark saying, "Just go cool off. Pain is not a good personality. But it is a very good teacher if you stop begging it to become something pretty." I moved from reception to file support, then to closing assistant. Nothing dramatic. No applause, just competence. A supervisor who noticed I didn't miss details. A couple of brutal quarter ends where I stayed late and learned more than I wanted. A small raise, then another. I got better at reading the real story inside a property. Who was underwater, who was bluffing, who had built their entire self-image around a thing the county could still sell out from under them. I did not stalk Diane's house. That matters. I did not sit around plotting in the dark like some fairy tale widow polishing revenge. I worked. I healed badly, then better. I dated once and ended it because he said on the third month, "You seem like someone who left a lot behind emotionally." And I realized I was tired of being read by men like weather. I saw the old neighborhood twice in 3 years. Once by accident, taking a detour around roadwork. Once on purpose in the second spring. When the ache of not knowing whether my father's rocking chair still existed got stronger than my pride, I drove past slowly. The paint on the porch rail looked worse. One shutter hung slightly crooked. The front flower bed which I used to weed myself had gone blunt and overgrown. Diane's car was there. So was a contractor van. I kept driving. That was enough. Enough to know the house was aging. Enough to know she was not maintaining it the way she had maintained appearances. Enough to feel the old humiliation rise in me and pass through instead of setting up a home in my chest again. By the 3rd year I had savings. Not fortune, not movie money. Real money. Boring money. Emergency money. Money that came from choosing groceries carefully and saying no to things no one posts online. Money that looked unimpressive until you realized it could change your relationship to a locked door. Then the notice came across my desk. Not directly to me, not as gossip, not as some magical perfect coincidence. It came as one more public filing in a stack of routine work I was helping process. Auction schedule, property address, my old street, my old house. For a second I thought my eyes had filled in the line wrong, that the numbers had tricked me because memory is greedy. Then I checked again. There it was. Diane had taken out the reverse mortgage. Taxes had slipped. Insurance issues had stacked. Cure periods had passed. Extensions had ended. The kind of slow-motion collapse that feels shocking only to the person who mistook delay for rescue. I sat very still at my desk. Not triumphant. Not yet. Something stranger. Like the whole room had tilted and an old sentence was finally returning with interest. The house you used to prove I had no place was about to become available to anyone who could meet the terms. Anyone. I went to the restroom and locked the stall and leaned my head back against the wall. My hands were shaking. Not because revenge had suddenly become real, because the past had stopped being sealed. It is hard to explain what it feels like when the exact structure that once humiliated you finally becomes vulnerable in a way the law recognizes. Not softer, not kinder, vulnerable. I remember washing my hands twice. I remember looking at my face in the mirror and thinking, don't make this romantic. Don't make it holy. Don't make it bigger than it is. A house was going to auction. That was all. And yet it wasn't all. Because somewhere inside that house was my father's rocking chair. Inside that house lived the woman who had looked at me during the worst week of my life and decided that made me removable. Inside that house had stood the man who let her. And now the front door was opening in the only language that had ever truly mattered there. Money, deadlines, signatures, possession. If you were me, tell the truth, would you have let that house go? Or would you have shown up to see what price the past finally had? I told myself I only needed information. That was my first lie. I pulled the public auction documents that night from my own laptop at home with Leah beside me on the couch holding a glass of wine she had forgotten to drink. She read over my shoulder. Is this real? Yes. Can she stop it? Maybe, I said. If she cures everything in time, can she? I thought about the overgrown flower bed, the contractor van, the delayed taxes, the kind of woman Diane was. Proud, controlling, image-conscious, and certain that consequences were for people less disciplined than she thought she was. I don't know, I said. Leah knew me well enough not to ask the wrong question first. Instead, she asked, do you want to bid? I looked at the screen. I thought about the rocking chair. I thought about the porch. I thought about spending 3 years learning one file at a time. That ownership is not emotion. It is structure. It is preparedness. It is the ability to do on paper what another person was sure you never could. Yes, I said. Leah put her wine down. Then we do this the smart way. That was why I trusted her. Leah has never confused rage with strategy. Over the next 2 weeks I became the calmest version of myself I had ever met. Not because I wasn't emotional, because I was. But some emotions finally mature into discipline if you stop feeding them speeches. I spoke with a lender first, then decided against financing, because I did not want timing risk. I moved money I had. I liquidated one investment that was modest enough to part with, and meaningful enough to sting. I borrowed a small short-term amount from Leah under terms so clear she insisted we write them down. That made me love her more, not less. I set a ceiling. A real one. No fantasy bidding. No ruining my future just to make a point about the past. If the house went above it, I would let it go. That mattered. Otherwise I would only be handing Diane the power to distort me one last time. The night before the auction I barely slept. Not from nerves about winning. From the strange intimacy of return. I knew what the front hall smelled like after rain. I knew the sound the upstairs third step made when someone heavy hit it too fast. I knew where sunlight sat on the landing in late afternoon. I knew what corner my father's rocking chair had occupied in a room that was once supposed to hold my child. And I knew that by noon the next day that house would belong either to the future or to the same old story. I dressed simply. Black slacks, cream blouse, low heels, hair back, no jewelry except a watch. I wanted to look like what I had spent 3 years becoming. Not wounded, not theatrical, not vindictive, competent. The auction room was smaller than people imagine if their only reference for this kind of thing comes from TV. Fluorescent light, folding chairs, too much coffee smell, quiet conversations no one fully trusted, a few investors, a few locals, a man in a navy cap scrolling his phone, 2 women discussing another property, 1 town over, paper packets, numbers, boredom mixed with appetite. And there in the back row sat Diane. She looked older than the 3 years between us should have allowed. Not ruined. Life is less poetic than that. Just reduced in ways money, stress, and pride carve into people who once mistook control for invincibility. Her coat was good quality but a season old. Her posture was perfect in the way brittle things stay straight. She had not seen me yet. For 1 second, all the old air came back. The porch, the duffel, Mark's face, my sister's couch. The text, "Mom changed the code." Then Diane turned slightly, and our eyes met. Her whole body went still. I did not smile. That mattered to me later. That I did not smile. Because if I had, I would have made it about cruelty. And cruel was never the role I wanted in this story. Her mouth parted by maybe half an inch. Not enough for drama. Enough for recognition. I took a seat 3 rows ahead of her. Let her look at the back of my head. The property order moved slower than I wanted. A commercial lot. 2 rental units. Some parcel dispute nobody cared about but the lawyers. I could feel Diane behind me like static. At one point I heard her stand. I thought she might leave. Instead she came up the side aisle and stopped near my chair. "Rachel." I looked up. She kept her voice low. "What are you doing here?" So many answers were available. I chose the clean one. Business. Her eyes sharpened. "This is not your business." There was a time that sentence would have hit me in the chest. Now it landed on the table between us like old silver nobody polished anymore. I said, "We'll see." She stared a moment longer, then went back to her seat. I did not turn around. When the property was finally called, the room changed in that subtle way rooms do. When money gets personal, people sat differently. Pages stopped rustling. Even the bored man in the cap looked up. The opening number came in lower than I expected. One investor bid. Then another. I waited. Diane's breathing behind me sounded louder than the auctioneer. The number rose. Not fast. Measured. I entered. A couple heads turned. One investor glanced my way, recalibrated, and kept going. Diane made a sound I heard more than saw. The bidding climbed into the range I had expected. Then near the edge of what I knew some of them would tolerate, 2 people dropped. It was me and one investor with a tired leather briefcase. The auctioneer called for the next number. The investor hesitated. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. He shook his head. And just like that, the room was full of paperwork. No music. No cinematic pause. Just a man saying the number once, twice, 3 times, and a gavel landing on a life that had already started changing before the sound finished. Sold. To bidder 21. Me. For about 2 seconds nobody moved. Then the room resumed being itself. Chairs scraping. Quiet talk. Pens. Transfer instructions. The ordinary machinery of irreversible things. I stood and walked to the processing table. When I handed over the cashier's check, my fingers were steady. That is still one of the things I am proudest of. Not the win. The steadiness. Because 3 years earlier that same family had looked at me and seen a woman too broken to protect even her father's chair. And now I was signing my name with enough money and enough calm to buy the front door they thought I had lost forever. When I turned, Diane was standing near the aisle. Her face had gone pale in patches instead of evenly, which made her look angrier than sick. "This is obscene," she said. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said the line I did not know I had been carrying for 3 years. "You were right about one thing. The house belongs to the person who can keep it." She actually flinched. Not loudly. Not theatrically. But enough. That was the first real reversal. Not the sale. The recognition. The exact language she had once used to cut me down had come back wearing legal shoes. "This is my home," she said. "No," I said. "It was the home you used to prove I didn't have one." She glanced around, then aware at last that people could hear enough to understand tone even if they missed details. She lowered her voice. "You're doing this out of spite." I almost laughed. Spite is impulsive. Spite throws glasses. Spite sends midnight texts. Spite does not spend 3 years rebuilding credit, learning county records, setting bid ceilings, and arriving with a cashier's check. "This," I said, "is what it looks like when timing finally stops helping you." A man from the processing table called my bidder number for signatures. I stepped away. Diane followed me halfway and hissed, "Mark will hear about this." At that, I finally looked fully at her. "Mark heard you the first time." I left her standing there. If buying the house back was justice, revenge, or both, hold that thought. Because the sale was not the ugliest part. The ugliest part was what I found after I got the legal right to walk inside again. Possession took a few days to formalize, though the legal transfer was secure. I handled every step cleanly. Funds settled. title work, recording, occupancy notices, locksmith scheduling, insurance. The kind of administrative rhythm that would have bored me before I understood how much dignity lives inside boring things. Mark called on the second day. I let it ring twice before I answered. Rachel. He sounded older too, though less honestly than Diane had. Stress ages some people. Regret only softens their voice. You heard, I said. I heard enough. That would be a first. He exhaled. Can we not do this like that? Still the same man. Still wanting tone control more than truth. You mean directly mom's in a bad place. I leaned back in my desk chair and stared at the ceiling for a second. Not because I needed patience. Because I wanted to hear how far he would go before he recognized himself. Your mother was in a strong place, I said when she put my suitcase on the porch. Silence. Then, that was a complicated time. There it was. The rewrite, the soft scrub over rot. I said no. It was a very simple time. She decided I had nothing left to stay for and you let her. He tried another angle. You act like I had control over everything. I closed my eyes. No, I said, I act like you had control over yourself. And you still failed. He got quiet then. The dangerous quiet of someone realizing the old strategies don't fit anymore. Finally, he said, what do you want from us? Even then, I answered honestly, nothing. That's why this is finally clean. On possession day, I met the locksmith at the house just after 9 in the morning. The sky was pale and cold, the kind of bright that makes every flaw on a building easier to see. Up close, the neglect was worse. Paint blistered near the porch rail. Water damage beginning at one window corner. Gutters clogged. The flower bed beyond saving. Without effort nobody had given it. The house looked like pride. After 3 years. Without maintenance. Diane was still inside. Legally she had a short window to clear out under the sale terms and subsequent notice, but she had already been warned we were changing exterior access and documenting contents. I was not there to scream at her. I was there to begin. She opened the door before the locksmith knocked. For a second we just stood there. Same porch, same threshold, same 2 women, different law. Her hair was done, coat buttoned, lipstick on. Diane had always believed in dressing for rank. Even when rank was collapsing. I hope you're proud of yourself, she said. That's the thing about people like her. They think shame is a rope you can always throw, and someone else will grab. I said I'm prepared. That's different. The locksmith asked politely if he should wait. No, I said. Go ahead. He worked on the panel while I stood in the foyer of the house I had not entered in 3 years. Smell hits memory faster than sight. Dust. Old wood. Diane's hand soap. The faint stale note of a house that had stopped being cared for as lovingly as it was defended. My chest tightened so hard I almost stepped back outside. Then I saw the stairs. Same landing. Same runner rug. Same wall where I had once held a paint sample against the light and asked Mark if the nursery blue looked too gray. There are moments when the past does not return as emotion. It returns as geography. Diane was still watching me. Take whatever satisfaction you came for, she said. But don't pretend this is decent. I turned to her. The last time I stood here I said I needed permission to come back for my own things. Today I have a title number. That landed. Not because it was clever. Because it was true. The locksmith finished. New code. New keys. Change logged. Receipt signed. Paperwork not shouting. I asked Diane where the rest of her packed items were. She gestured toward the den and downstairs storage with a kind of brittle contempt. As if organization itself had become an insult because it was now happening to her. I began upstairs first. Not because it made practical sense. Because there was only one room that mattered before all the others. The nursery door stuck slightly at the frame. It always had in humid weather. I opened it and stood there. The room had been repainted. Cream now, not soft blue. The shelves were gone. The dresser was gone. The lamp was gone. For one awful second I thought the chair would be gone too. It wasn't in the corner. I felt heat rush to my face. Then I saw the scratch marks on the floor near the closet. Drag marks. Old, faint, but visible if you knew what had once stood there. I stood so still I could hear Diane moving downstairs. I checked the closet. Nothing but old hangers and a broken suitcase handle. I went down the hall to the linen closet. then the guest room, then the basement stairs. And there it was. My father's rocking chair sat in the lower level near a shelf of paint cans and holiday bins. Dust on the arms. One leg nicked. A folded moving blanket thrown over the back like it was storage, like it had always been storage, like the last pair of hands that loved it had never existed. That was the moment I almost lost my composure. Not at the auction. Not on the porch. Not signing the transfer. There. Because some things don't stop being desecrated just because time passes. I touched the arm and felt dust come away on my fingers. Then I laughed once under my breath, not kindly. Of course she had shoved it downstairs. She hadn't just locked me out. She had downgraded memory. Demoted it. Put my father beside old paint and forgotten Christmas lights, because that is what people like Diane do when they cannot bear what an object represents for someone else. I called the moving company I had arranged in advance, and told them to prioritize the chair. Then I went through the storage shelves for inventory. That was when I found the binder. Plain black. Tabbed. Loan statements. Tax notices. Insurance correspondence. Final warnings. Past due letters stacked in angry sequence. A copy of the deed transfer from Mark to Diane. Notes in Diane's handwriting. Dates circled. Amounts underlined. The private paper trail of a woman who had believed paperwork would always obey her as long as she glared hard enough at it. Tucked into the back pocket of the binder was something even better. The old alarm service invoice from the exact week I had been thrown out. System recode completed. Date. Time. 1:12 p.m. The afternoon before she put my suitcase on the porch. I sat on the basement step holding that paper, and felt the whole structure of my memory lock into place. Because now I didn't just know what happened. I could prove sequence. She had changed the alarm code before the confrontation. Pre-planned lockout. Not grief. Not chaos. Not a family emergency handled badly. A decision. I took a picture of the invoice, and slipped the original into a folder I had brought with me. Then I found something else. Printed text. Diane had printed some of Mark's texts for her own records, probably related to the loan mess, and in the stack were older pages too. One included the line he had sent me, "Mom changed the code. Just give it a few days." I had my own screenshot, already backed up in 2 places. But there is something devastating about seeing your own humiliation preserved by the people who did it as if even they understood it mattered. By the time I came back upstairs, my hands were no longer shaking. Diane was in the kitchen, pretending to sort silverware into a box. I set the copied alarm invoice on the counter between us. She looked at it, then at me. I said, "You changed the code before you threw me out." Her face changed very little. That was one of her strengths. She had spent years practicing the management of facial consequences. It was a security issue. The day before she slid the page back toward me. "You were unstable." There are words people use when they want to excuse themselves from ever having to admit who they were to you. Unstable. Not grieving. Not recovering. Not blindsided. Unstable. I said you planned the lockout before you packed my bag. She shrugged. And in that shrug was more confession than apology would ever have given me. I did what my son was too weak to do. That was the first real admission. Not shouted. Not dramatic. But clean. I looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," I said. She frowned. For what? For finally being honest. She seemed to understand too late that honesty is dangerous when the other person has already stopped needing your approval. That afternoon, Mrs. Alvarez came over with a loaf of sweet bread wrapped in a towel. She stood at the threshold and looked past me into the foyer, with the careful curiosity of someone trying not to intrude on a story she had already witnessed one chapter of. "I heard there was a sale," she said. "There was." Her eyes dropped to the key ring in my hand, then lifted back to my face. "Well," she said softly, "I guess I know who won." I surprised myself by smiling. Not out of triumph. Out of relief at being seen correctly by someone who had also seen me when I had been thrown away. She hesitated, then said, "I always wanted you to know something." That day on the porch I wrote down the date after I went inside. It bothered me. The way she stood in the doorway. The way he never came all the way out. I stared at her. She continued, "Maybe that sounds strange. But I thought if anyone ever lies about what happened, I don't want to forget what I saw. Some people hand you justice with a speech. Some people hand it to you by simply refusing to let memory be bullied. I asked if she would put that in writing. She said yes. An hour later, she sat at my old dining table with a legal pad and wrote in neat, determined script that she had seen my suitcase on the porch, seen Diane block the doorway, seen Mark remain inside, and heard enough to understand I was being put out, not choosing to leave. That statement combined with my text records, the alarm invoice, the deed timeline, and Diane's own ugly little confession in the kitchen was more than enough for what I needed. Not a court case, not a television ending, something quieter. The truth with structure around it. Mark came by just before dusk. He had gotten used to walking into places as if decency would rise to meet him. That habit left him the second he saw me standing in the foyer with my own keys. He looked around the house like someone visiting his childhood after the museum signs go up. "This is really happening," he said. "It happened at the auction." He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "Mom said you're trying to make her look monstrous." I almost laughed. "Your mother didn't need my help." He glanced toward the kitchen where the binder and copied documents sat stacked in a neat file. "So what now?" I picked up the alarm invoice and held it out. He didn't take it. "She changed the code at 1:12 in the afternoon the day before the suitcase," I said. "You texted me the next morning that she'd changed it, and to give it a few days. Mrs. Alvarez saw the porch scene and wrote it down. And your mother just admitted she did what you were too weak to do." His jaw tightened. "You're twisting everything." "No. That was the old move." I stepped closer and lowered my voice, not for drama, but because quiet was all it took now. "No, Mark. Twisting everything was telling people I needed rest with my family. Twisting everything was letting your mother turn a planned lockout into grief management. Twisting everything was acting like I drifted out of this house instead of being removed from it." He looked away. "There are people who can lie as long as the room is warm enough. Bring in paper dates, witnesses, and proper nouns, and their whole personality sags." "I didn't know what to do," he said finally. I believed him. "That's what made it so pathetic." "Exactly," I said. He looked at me then, maybe expecting more anger, maybe hoping for some version of the woman on the porch he could survive by enduring. What he got was worse for him. "Calm," I said. "The difference between us is not that I suffered, and you didn't. The difference is that I learned from it." He stared at me, and for once, there was no softer hallway for him to slip into. I gestured toward the door. "You can go now." He didn't move. "Rachel, she's still my mother." "Yes," I said. "And you were still my husband." That was the end of that conversation. Once the truth is in your hands, and the house is legally yours, what do you owe the people who used your weakest moment against you? Mercy? Distance? Nothing. I knew my answer before. Diane asked the question out loud. I just hadn't heard her say it yet. The movers brought my father's rocking chair upstairs before sunset. I had them place it in the front room, near the window instead of the nursery that no longer existed as a nursery. I stood there, after they left, one hand on the back of the chair, and let myself feel the weight of 3 separate absences, without trying to tidy them into a lesson. The baby I never got to meet. The marriage that had been weaker than I wanted to know. The woman I had been when a suitcase on a porch could still make me believe I had become unworthy. Grief changes when power returns. It does not disappear. It just stops being the only voice in the room. I sat in the chair and rocked once, twice, listening to the wood complain softly like it remembered me too. The house was quiet. Not empty. Quiet. There is a difference. I spent the next week handling what adults handle when sentiment has to live beside legality. Occupancy deadlines. Access times for Diane's remaining belongings. Utility transfers. Insurance inspection. Repair quotes. Roofing estimate. Gutter cleaning. Window damage. Numbers. More numbers. The glamorous side of poetic revenge, if anyone still wants to call it that. Diane asked for a meeting on the 4th day. I agreed because avoiding a person is not always the same thing as having boundaries. Sometimes boundaries are clearest when spoken directly. She sat at the dining table with her handbag on her lap, dressed as if she were attending a committee hearing, where dignity might still vote in her favor. I stayed standing for a moment before sitting across from her. She looked around the room slowly. "You moved the chair." "It's mine." Her mouth tightened, then she asked, "What are you going to do with this place?" That question told me more than anything else could have. She still thought the house was the center of the story. People like Diane never understand when they stop being the deciding factor and start becoming context. I haven't finalized it, I said. You can't possibly want to live here. Want? As if wanting had ever been the point. I folded my hands on the table. I didn't buy this house because I wanted my old life back. Then why? I held her gaze. Because you used this house to decide I had no place. I wanted that decision back. For the first time since the auction, her face loosened into something close to fatigue. You always were dramatic, she said. That almost made me smile. Even now, even seated in a house she had lost. Even after the sale, the paperwork, the inventory, the witness statement, the alarm invoice, and her own confession. Still, she needed the world to be a stage where I was the excessive one, and she was merely practical. No, I said. You just never liked it when your choices had visible consequences. She looked down at her handbag and smoothed one finger over the seam. Then, without looking at me, she said, I need more time. There it was. The question beneath all the posture. Not apology, not remorse. Time. I let the silence sit long enough to be honest. How much? A few months. I shook my head immediately. Her eyes snapped up. You have the money. You have the title. What difference does it make? That is one of the great privileges of people who once denied you decency. They often come back asking for flexibility as if they were always entitled to the shape of your generosity. It makes a difference, I said, because the last time someone in this house needed time, you put her suitcase on the porch. A flush crept up her neck. That is not the same. No, it isn't. I'm giving you written notice, scheduled access, and a list of 2 senior housing agencies plus a storage unit I already paid for through the end of next month. That is more than the same. She stared at me like kindness had become offensive once it stopped kneeling. I am an old woman, she said. I kept my voice level. And I was a grieving woman. That was the line that broke whatever illusion she had left, that I might be manipulated back into softness by optics. She pushed back from the table. So this is punishment. I stood too. No, I said. Punishment would have been doing to you what you did to me. This is a boundary. She looked around the room again, maybe hoping the house itself would rescue her, maybe hearing for the first time that walls do not testify for character. Then she said the one thing that finally made me feel almost sorry for her. You really won't let me stay. Not won't. Really won't. As if there had still been some hidden feminine duty waiting in me to override memory. I answered carefully because truth deserves exact words at the end. I didn't buy this house to become you. I bought it so you would never decide my place again. She nodded once. Not agreement. Recognition. Then she picked up her handbag and walked to the door I now owned. I did not follow closely behind her like a guard. I did not savor it. I did not offer comfort either. There is a version of mercy people try to extract only after they have run out of leverage. I have no respect for that version. At the threshold she paused and turned back. Mark says you've changed. I almost said, so has title. Instead I told the truth. No. I just stopped asking the wrong people to tell me who I was. She left. The screen door closed. This time the sound was ordinary in a different way. Over the next 2 weeks, Diane cleared out what remained. I allowed scheduled pickups. I kept records. I had one of Leah's friends present for the final access day, because witnesses are cheaper than regret. Diane tried twice to reopen the moral argument. Once by saying family shouldn't do this to each other. Once by asking whether holding on to pain had really made me happy. I answered both times with the same kind of calm that used to terrify me in other people and now steadied me in myself. This was never about happiness. It was about authority. About the right to define what happened. About whether the worst week of my life would remain the sentence that described me or just the doorway out of a version of myself that still confused endurance with belonging. Mark tried once more too. He called the evening before Diane's last access day and said, "She keeps saying you're cold now." I stood in the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter I had once scrubbed while her mother judged how I loaded the dishwasher. Cold would have been putting her bags on the porch, I said. He was quiet. Then I was grieving too. That line deserved an honest answer. I know, I said. But grief didn't make you betray me. It just revealed what you do when choosing becomes uncomfortable. He said my name softly then, the way men do, when they want softness from the woman they failed without ever naming the failure. I didn't give it to him. I hope you learn the difference before the next person trusts you, I said, and ended the call. On Diane's final day in the house, I stayed mostly upstairs while movers handled the last of her furniture. Not because I was avoiding her, because I had already said everything worth saying. Near the end, I heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to see her standing at the top landing looking toward the room that had once been the nursery. For one suspended second I wondered whether age, loss, and consequences had finally scraped some honest thing loose in her. She looked at the half-open door and said, "I never understood why you cared so much about that chair. There are people who can stand in the aftermath of everything they destroyed and still reveal that they missed the whole point from the beginning." I walked past her into the front room, put my hand on the rocking chair and turned back. "It was never about whether you understood," I said. "It was about whether you thought your misunderstanding gave you the right to take." She held my gaze a moment longer, then went downstairs. That was our last real conversation. After she left, I stood at the front door with the new key in my palm and looked out at the porch where my suitcase had once stood. The boards had been repaired in one corner. I had already scheduled the rail work. The flower beds were stripped back to soil, waiting for something better than neglect and performance. The house looked raw in places, honest in others. Repairable everywhere. I didn't move in right away. That surprises people when they hear this story. They assume I either rushed back in like I had conquered a kingdom, or sold it immediately to prove detachment. I did neither. I kept it for a while, long enough to restore what needed restoring. Long enough to sit in the chair in the late afternoon, and let that front window hold my reflection without shame. Long enough to repaint the back room into a study with built-in shelves, and no ghosts disguised as plans. I hired professionals where it mattered. Roof patch, window trim, plumbing corrections. I did some smaller work myself. Sanded an old table, replaced cabinet hardware, cleared the front beds one Saturday with Leah beside me in ripped jeans and righteous joy. At one point she stood back, hands on hips, dirt on her forearms, and said, "You know people are going to debate whether this was savage or healing." I laughed. "It can be both," she grinned. "That's why I'm proud of you." 6 months later I sold the house. That decision came slowly, then all at once. Not because I couldn't bear it. Because I no longer needed it in the same way. I had bought the right to return. I had recovered the chair. I had corrected the lie. I had looked at the front door without shrinking. The house had done what it needed to do for me. Keeping it forever would have turned it back into a shrine to injury. I didn't want that. I wanted freedom, not a museum. The sale gave me enough to make the down payment on a smaller place across town. One with a wide front window just right, for my father's rocking chair, and no inherited power lurking on the first floor. My own name, my own mortgage, my own code, my own door. When I locked the old house for the final time, I stood on the porch a minute longer than necessary. Not for nostalgia. For symmetry. 3 years earlier I had stood there in socks carrying the shape of a life somebody else had decided was over. Now I stood there in heels, holding a folder thick with recorded documents, proceeds transfer confirmations, and one witness statement written in neat script by a neighbor who had refused to let memory be bullied. I thought about the baby. I thought about the woman on Leah's couch. I thought about how often people confuse being chosen with being safe. Then I closed the door. Gently. That part matters too. I did not slam it. I did not need to. People who have been publicly humiliated often fantasize about becoming louder when power returns. I understand that fantasy. I really do. But in my experience, the deepest shift is quieter than that. It is the moment you realize you no longer need the person who hurt you to agree with the truth, for the truth to govern the room. Diane never apologized. Mark never found a version of courage that could travel backward. Mrs. Alvarez sent me a Christmas card that year with a short note inside. "I'm glad the house found its way to better hands before it moved on." I kept that card. The rocking chair sits by my front window now. Some evenings I rock in it, with tea gone cold beside me, and think about how pain can make you easier to remove if you hand the wrong people the right to interpret it. Other nights I don't think about the old house at all. That may be the cleanest ending of all. Not forgetting. Just no longer orbiting the place where you were once reduced. The lesson is not that ownership heals everything. It doesn't. Paperwork cannot return a child. It cannot make betrayal less ugly. It cannot turn a weak husband into a strong one or a controlling woman into a decent one. What it can do is close a lie. What it can do is put structure around truth. What it can do is give a woman back the right to stand at a threshold and know she belongs there because she built the life that bought the key. That was enough for me. More than enough, actually. Because by the end, the best part was not that Diane lost the house. It was that she finally had to stand inside the consequences of what she had done in it. And I had to stand there too. Not as the woman she pushed outside. As the woman who came back with the receipt, the records, the witness, the chair, and the final say. So tell me this. If your mother-in-law put your suitcase on the porch a week after your loss, would you ever forgive her? If someone used your weakest moment to erase your place in a home, would buying it back feel like justice, revenge, or just the cleanest answer available? And if you've ever had to rebuild after family decided pain made you disposable, I want to hear that too. Because some people will say I was cold for not letting Diane stay. Some will say I was kinder than she deserved. And some will understand exactly why the woman who got thrown out in grief came back with paperwork instead of tears.